Welcome to Streamlined Insights, the international and scientific measure of our world. I'm Streamlined Engine. For the foreseeable future, this unit will be talking about the complex relationship of the chips industry along with some other state-of-the-art technology like quantum computers and artificial intelligence, AI. Their complex relationship, I say, with the political arena, whether it be international, diplomatic, domestic, national, and so forth. Now, when we talk about these two things, most of you would think that they have nothing to do with each other, right? I mean, what does the technology industry have to do with politics? Well, as it turns out, it has plenty to do with politics. A nation's strength in the chip industry decides its wealth and relevance in the world today. I'm serious. When we talk about the chips industry later on, you'll see what I mean. And the political environment of that country influences how a chip industry can thrive or maybe can fall. You will see examples of both thriving and falling chips industry due to the political environment in that country and the international political environment further on in this episode. So, for today's pilot episode, I think it'll be nice for everybody, you listening and me included. I think it'll be nice for us to first establish who is doing what in this game. What are the major players, the major countries, the major companies that are involved in the chip industry, and what are they all doing? I will not be getting into the history of how they all got here. If you want a comprehensive history of the chip industry, I recommend checking out The Chips War. Good stuff. Chris Miller. He really included everything from the 1940s when semiconductors were first introduced all the way until the 2010s. So if you want history, go and look at his thing. But today, we are going to look at what's happening now. Alright, the chip industry. One thing you have to remember about an industry is that there are people who wants to buy certain stuff, and there are people who sell those stuff to those people who made those stuff to sell because there are those customers. So we'll get through the customer side first because that is much easier. So think about it. Who buys chips? Who will need chips? Like, all of you need to buy food, or if you need to buy fuel to get through your life, but who needs to buy chips? Well, as it happens, anyone who manufactures electronics in their life, in their career, will need semiconductors, will need chips. So, whether you are Hitachi, or you're LG, or you're Datong, and you're making refrigerators, air cons, and rice cookers, you will need chips. Or, for example, you're Lenovo, you're Apple, and you're HTC, and you're making personal devices, not the kind that you use in homes, but the one that you're using to view this program, for example, tablets, personal computers, or phones. You will need chips to be included in your products. Or, for example, you are the Ministry of Defense of Great Britain, or you are the Pentagon of the United States. You are making armaments, you are making cruise missiles, and you are making tomahawks. You need chips to be included in your systems if you want to properly guide your electronics. Alright, so that's the buyer side of things. What about the seller side? Like, who is manufacturing those chips, and just how exactly are they doing it? Well, just like a lot of industries, the chip industry is divided into upstream, midstream, and downstream of the industry. So we'll start with the upstream. We'll start with the upstream first. The upstream includes mining those semiconductor materials out of the ground, and it includes the manufacturing of those machines that you will need to manufacture the chips. And of course, it also includes the research and development of those chips. Alright, so let's get a few linguistic things out of the way first. People use the terms semiconductors and chips pretty interchangeably. To speak of one is to speak of the other, but we are all professionals here, so we have to make this distinction. When you are talking about semiconductors, you are talking more about the chemical and physical property of things. Like, for example, you have insulators, materials that barely conduct any electronics at all. For example, timber, glass, or plastic. These stuff, they don't conduct electricity at all. Barely. They conduct a little, but it requires a lot of pressure, a lot of heat, and a lot of external factors if you want them to conduct electricity. And then you have conductors like metal, iron, copper, silver, gold that conduct electricity very easily. You don't need much persuading. You don't need to heat it or add pressure to it or control the electrical charges for them to go through the metals. When it comes to semiconductors, it means that on a normal occasion, they don't conduct electricity that much. But when you control certain factors, for example, you heat it up, or for example, you add pressure onto it, or for example, you control the electrical charges through it, then it becomes very useful and very good for you to conduct electricity through them in the way that pleases you. This is why semiconductors are so good for manufacturing electronic devices, because not only do you want to control electronics, you want to control how they move, when they're on, when they're off, where they go, right? So, what kind of materials are good for semiconductors? Well, as I just said, silicon and gallium, germanium, and if you just take out a periodic table of the elements, you will see what I mean. There is a stairwell kind of formation on the right side of the table that will tell you what materials are semiconductors. And also, at the bottom of the periodic table, those are called lanthanides and andesites. Those are called rare earth metals commonly, and they are very good for semiconductors as well, because they are highly conductive of heat, they are highly conductive of electricity, they are highly magnetic, and they are very stable. So, who mines these materials out of the earth? These are all included in our crust. So who gets them out? Let's look at silicon first. I'll give you some time to guess. Well, it doesn't really need much guessing. If you're already familiar with the topic, you would know that China is the biggest producer of silicon. They have a 55% of market share of the total global silicon production, followed up by the United States, which trails far behind at only 15%. And then there's Brazil, and Russia, and Norway, but they all make up only single-digit percentage of the global silicon production. Right? So, what about gallium and germanium? You guessed it, it's China. And this time, they have a whopping 90% of the global market. So, Canada, the US, Australia, and Russia, they can only divide up the remaining 10%. When you take into account that China literally produces 90% of all gallium and germanium in the world, you can understand that when China announced they are setting up an export quota and they're going to limit to whom, to what entities, what countries, or what companies they're going to allow the exports of gallium germanium to go to, you can understand why it caused some alarm. But rare earth metals, not gallium germanium, is where China has the absolute monopoly. You want to guess how much China is leading in rare earth metals? 97%. 97.5% to 97%. It fluctuates every year. But anyway, the point is, the US, Canada, Australia, and Russia, they can only divide up the remaining 2.5% of the market amongst themselves. So, when you consider the upstream of semiconductors, China is pretty crucial. But, as it turns out, when we move on to other parts of the supply chain, limiting the outsourcing, limiting the export of semiconductor materials is just about the only thing that China can do, to be honest. So, as I said, the other parts of the upstream of semiconductor supply chain includes mining the materials and the research and development. When it comes to research and development, the Western coalition has a very strong monopoly over things. You can guess, who designs chips? Well, who needs chips, of course? As I just said, car manufacturers, electronic car manufacturers, Tesla, or personal devices manufacturers, Apple, Nvidia, and Intel. And of course, there's the British ARM Holdings, which, very interestingly, is nestled in the University of Cambridge. if you can imagine that. Well, these are the big players in the global semiconductors designing. ARM Holdings actually designs pretty much all the logic chips that we use. Because when it comes to chips, there are memory chips, logic chips, and of course, high-functioning chips. And ARMS, the British company, has a monopoly on the designing of logic chips. And then we move on to the manufacturing of those machinery that you need to produce chips. It's reasonable, right? Consider that you're cooking at home. You'll need knives, you'll need a cutting board, and you'll need a pot as well, right? It's the same thing when it comes to making semiconductors. So, who makes these machines that produce semiconductors? The Dutch company, ASML, they produce the only EUV lithography machine in the world. EUV stands for extra ultraviolet rays of light. It's invisible to our eyes, but it is very useful to craft microscopic, even nanometer scale electronic networks onto those wafers that I just mentioned. Wafer is just a piece of silicon when you break it down. So, the Dutch have a monopoly over that, and then the Japanese with Tokyo Electrons, Nikon and Canon, and Germany with Siemens Electrons, they have a monopoly over depository systems, cleaning systems, transitory systems, and so forth. So now we've established the upstream. You mine the materials, you design the chips, and you prepare the machinery you need to manufacture chips. We now move downward to middle stream. What happens at middle stream? The actual manufacturing of those chips. So, I think you can guess who are the big names when it actually comes to manufacturing the chips. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, abbreviated TSMC, they have a whopping 55% of the global market. The second in line, which is South Korea's Samsung Electronics, only has a 17% market share. So you can see that TSMC is leading the second player by more than 3 times the market share. And then following Samsung, you have Global Foundry, and UMC, another Taiwanese company, and then you have Intel. All 3 of which only comprises about a single-digit percentage of market share, so people rarely count them. So TSMC has a monopoly, and I mean a monopoly on chip production. It'll be pretty serious if something happens to them, right? For example, an armed invasion of the island of Taiwan. What will happen to the chip industry then? What will happen to the global chip industry then? Scary thought, right? An interesting thing to know that Japan once had a very large share in the manufacturing of chips, but that is no more. We will talk more about that in future episodes, but just think, TSMC is Taiwan held, Samsung, Korean held, Intel, US, Global Foundry, US, and UMC, another Taiwan company. Japan is no longer in the top 5. It's not even the top 10 if you take out the list and look. Well, Japan is planning to change that, and we shall see how they do it. Now we move on to downstream. So, again, think of when you're cooking at home. You have prepared all the cooking pots, you've prepared all your food materials, and then you've actually cooked your dish. The food is ready. What else is left to do? Well, you need to put them onto plates, and you need to actually get those plates onto the table, right? It's the same idea behind making chips. Once those chips are made, you have to put them into packages, you have to test how good they are, and then you need to deliver them to your customers. Like I said, Apple, Tesla, HTC, Hitachi, LG, or Datong. So, who does this? Who does this testing and packaging? Well, back in the 60s and 70s, last century back in the 60s and 70s, the division between midstream and downstream of semiconductor production is a little more pronounced than it is today. Back then, when Japan produced those chips, they would ship them out to South Korea, Taiwan, or even as far south as Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore for them to be tested and packaged. But nowadays, when Taiwan makes those chips, they test and package those chips basically by themselves. Well, TSMC doesn't do that by themselves. They have UMC do it for them. Remember UMC, that 5th largest semiconductor producing company? Well, their main work is testing and packaging those chips made by TSMC and then delivering them to customers. The other Taiwan company that does it is called ASE. In Mandarin, they are called Yueguang. So that is their business. They test and package the chips produced by TSMC, and then they send it over to customers. When things boil down, the testing and packaging of those chips is pretty much just as important as anything else. This is why they are all included in the same industrial complex, the Hsinchu Technology Complex. The idea is called vertical integration, as I just said. The division between midstream and downstream is not that pronounced anymore because everything is produced within a few 10 or at least, or at most, a few 100 kilometers of each other. They are all in Hsinchu, in that industrial complex. And you might think, well, the dishes have already been cooked. All that's remaining is for the food to be put on the plate. And you think that's a bit of a anticlimactic thing. You think that is a bit underwhelming. Well, what if I tell you that the global semiconductor industry, the global supply chain of things, is currently experiencing a shortage of kind because of a lack of proper packaging technology? It's true. In the whole scheme of things, in 2023, we're experiencing a cool down in the chip industry because there's too much being produced. In fact, this happens every 4 years in the semiconductor industry. It's nothing new. But what's new this year is the AI boom. So, while traditional personal electronics like Apple computers or iPhones are experiencing a supply over demand and the inventory is being stacked up in their depots with not as many people wanting to buy those devices as before, the AI industry is actually experiencing a shortage of the chips that they require. And one of the main reasons is that the COWOS technology, which is made by TSMC, by the way. COWOS stands for chips on wafers and on substrate, for those who are interested. There is a shortage of this technology, which is why the AI industry is not getting enough of the chips that they need. So if you think packaging and testing is a bit anticlimactic, I would advise you to think again. Now, let's go over that once again. We have completed our journey through the entire supply chain of semiconductors. We have the upstream, where you mine the materials, and then you make those equipments, and then you design the chips. You have the middle stream, where you actually manufacture the chips, and then you have the downstream, where you test and package it. This supply chain is a truly global one. From the Arctic north of Norway, all the way down south to Australia. From the mines in northeastern China, all the way around the world to Silicon Valley in California. It's a truly global supply chain. So, as you'd expect, free and open navigation of the ocean is vital. If material can't get from any one of these places to another, there's gonna be problems. Say something happened in Gibraltar, Suez, Malacca, or the Straits of Taiwan. The supply chain will be seriously disrupted. And if you think that, well, this is just one industry, right? How serious can it be? I mean, sometimes timber industries and steel industries experiences shaking downs. Well, the semiconductor industry, the chips industry's profitability over the last 10 years has a 0.5 correlation coefficient with the economic performance, the GDP of G7 countries. And the portfolio performance of chips industries like TSMC or UMC stocks have a 0.45 correlation coefficient as well on the entire performance of the stock market in the G7 countries. So I think that'll tell you how much the semiconductor industry and the chips industry influences the entire fate, the entire economic fortunes of that country. And even if you discard all those numbers, just by talking about the industry, the semiconductor industry, it involves mining, it involves high technology, and it involves handicraft. think of how many people will be out of a job, or think of how many jobs it will create just by the fall and rise of the semiconductor industry. And then what about the political side of things? Semiconductor supply chain, as I said, is a global one, so it is truly a child of globalization. Without global integration, this kind of supply chain, this kind of division of labor based upon opportunity costs, it wouldn't be probable. But when semiconductor has propelled globalization to what we know today, has the chips industry, in fact, decreased national pride and national competition between states? Well, the answer is no, an absolute no. Just think of to what length each nation would go to protect their supply of chips. Japan has already demonstrated quite an ugly side of that back in the 80s. The US has slapped sanctions on anyone who they disagreed with, limiting their exports of chips and chip technology and chip investment. And China is gearing themselves up to self-manufacture, to become self-sufficient in chips. So, people, this is where we are right now. This is the chips industry. A delicate balance between industry and politics, because semiconductor industry requires a lot of capital, a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of trained workers, none of which will be possible just by the industry alone. They will need the government to be on board. And then there is, of course, the government, who requires the semiconductor industry to boost their country's wealth and their relevance in the world. The three top economies of the world, US, China, and Japan, they all have robust places in the semiconductor industry. Western European countries, the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and Great Britain, their commercial and industrial might heyday is long behind them, and yet somehow they have managed to stay relevant in the global economy just by having a crucial junction point on the semiconductor supply chain. So, a delicate balance between industry and policy. And the delicate balance between global cooperation and national pride, and a delicate balance between war and peace. Because the semiconductor industry, like everyone else, they want a peaceful and stable environment to do business with. But then again, the chips industry relies on armaments and government defense contracts for a significant portion of their business. So, war is not exactly against their interests either. Do they want war? Do they want peace? This delicate balance. This is the world we are in right now, everyone. This is the chip industry. This is where we are right now. Today is the pilot episode, so we only talked about the who is who and who's doing what of the global semiconductor supply chain. In the following few weeks, we'll be going in depth into each player, each technology, and perhaps even each corporation as well. If you want to know more about how we got here, the entire history of the industry, I say, check out Chip War by Chris Miller. It has a very detailed description of everything. And if there's something in particular you would like me to talk about, sound off in the comments down below. Next week, we will be talking about China, everyone's favorite topic. I am Streamlined Engine, and you have been listening to Streamlined Insights.